Welcome to this webinar on forms accessibility and the key considerations for developers. We're going to be covering the following success criteria relating to forms. 3.3.1 is concerned with error identification. We'll also look at suggestions for fixing errors and how to prevent errors in the first place. And of course, we're going to be looking at the key issue of labels and instructions for forms. Starting off then, labels or instructions. The W3C describes this as labels or instructions are provided when content requires user input. So put simply, wherever there is a forms that require user input, there should be labels or instructions as necessary to inform users of basically how to interact with the form, how to complete it, what sort of data is required, and provide any other instructions that are needed in order to complete the process. So why are labels important? Well, where forms are used, users really need to know what information to enter. They need to know the type of information, and sometimes they'll need to know the format of the information. There are certain complex input mechanisms that may require multiple labels. We'll have a look at an example of one of those shortly. And labels instructions also are concerned with indicating required fields. In this case, the screenshot on the right, we can see that the required fields are indicated with an asterisk, but there does also need to be an instruction relating to that. And finally, indicating the expected format of input data. So a date of birth, is it a 4-digit year, YYYY, or is it a 2-digit year, YY? These are the sorts of things that labels should cover. Now, it's important for labels to be displayed in close proximity to the input field they represent. So we can see here on the right hand side, we've got the labels immediately above the input field. Now, the reason being is that sighted users benefit from that close proximity. It's easy to associate the label with the input field, but also users of screen magnification software, as they zoom in, any white space on the screen is magnified as well as all the content. And that means the larger the space between the label and the input field, the greater the distance for magnification users when they zoom in. It's not only important for that visual proximity, but also for labels to be programmatically associated with their input fields. What we mean by that is that software such as a screen reader or other user assistive technology can determine what label goes with which input field and alert their user to it by reading it out or describing it in some other way. So how can you test labels? Well, there's a very quick way you can actually test them with a mouse. I'm just going to go through some examples right now. So a very quick way of testing that labels are programmatically associated with their input fields. And all that means is if you tab through this form using a screen reader, it will know what label to read out automatically. Now, as a sighted user and using the mouse, I can quickly click on each of these labels. And if you can see, the cursor is actually appearing in the input field next to the label I click on. If I click in email address label, and then I start typing straight away, it actually starts typing into the email address input field. And because I'm clicking on the label, that just tells me the association is set up. So those input fields are programmatically associated with these labels. This is particularly useful for very small controls like checkboxes or radio buttons. These can be very fiddly to interact with, to click on or select, particularly for people who might have tremors or hand control difficulties, making it difficult to use the mouse. Instead of having a very small target area, you can click on the label, which is a much bigger target area, and use that to toggle a checkbox or radio button on or off. So that's a very easy way where you can go onto a page, click on the label, and if that sets the focus into the relevant input field, that tells you that input field and that label are correctly associated. Where we have complex labels, this will require some form of screen reader testing in order to be sure that the labels are set up properly. So what do I mean by a complex label? If we zoom in so I can show you exactly what I mean, there's a couple of good examples here. Fuel type is given these 4 sub options within it. So each of these 4 options is really labeled by 2 things. So this second input field here is gas, but it's related to the fuel type. The third one is non-half hourly, that's also related to the fuel type. So you can think of each of these checkboxes as having two visible labels. So how then do we associate multiple labels with a single input field? Now, if we click on this label here, we can see it toggles the checkbox, but that doesn't tell us if this label over here is associated with the checkbox. So really, it doesn't tell us if the checkbox is correctly labeled using both of these labels. This is why we would need to use a screen reader and actually tab through the form and check that it reads out the correct labels. Now, I evaluated this form earlier using the JAWS screen reader and noted that as I tab through these input fields, it just reads out half-hourly gas, non-half hourly, and unmetered supply. It does not mention the fuel type at all. So we'll look in a few slides at how we can actually address that and do that properly. It's just worth noting that some functionality can be tested with the toolbar. So the Web Accessibility toolbar for Internet Explorer, if you go to the Structure menu, you can actually highlight field sets and labels, and that will actually highlight all of the labels on a page, but it will also highlight any field sets and legends. Now, it doesn't look like there are any field sets or legends on this page, so that's not something we need to be concerned with, but that might be a good case to use them for the, if I just refresh the page to clean it up a little, using a field set would be useful around this fuel type and this for subsequent checkboxes, because a field set and legend allows grouping of very similar or related input fields under a generic or core heading. In this case, the core heading would be the fuel type. Each of these would have their own label, and each one would be associated with the heading and their own label. So that's a really good use case for field sets and labels, but there aren't any on this page, so we'll investigate that a bit further. So simple labels really have a one-to-one relationship with the form field. One form field, one label, and that is a simple label. Now the way to do that and mark that up is by using the for attribute on the label element and the ID attribute on the input field. And you assign these the same value. So you give the input field an ID and then you reference that ID using the label, and that creates a programmatic association between the input field and the label. And that is what allows you to click on the label and set focus into the input field, because the browser knows that that input field is related to that label. For complex labels then, I mentioned that we could use a field set and legend. So how would this work? Well, we wrap the whole thing in a field set element, and we use a legend which describes the main question that we're associating with all of the input fields, in this case fuel type, and then for each checkbox we just mark it up as standard with its correct label using the for attribute and the ID attribute. So in this case, using the field set creates that association. Each of those checkboxes is now associated with two labels. There is another way of marking up complex labels. So ARIA labeled by, that allows a single input field to reference multiple labels by each of their IDs. So each of these checkboxes might incorporate an ARIA labeled by attribute, and that would be given the ID of the fuel type label and then the ID of their adjacent label as well. That's really powerful because unlike a field set and legend, it allows you to associate 3 or 4 labels, in fact, which may be required sometimes. You may have that many labels for a single input field, and that is where you would really be having to use the ARIA labeled by attribute. Okay, why are instructions important then? So instructions are the other component of the labels and instructions success criteria. Well, users often need additional instructions and information relating to forms. A good example is what are required fields, and how can you spot a required field? What information is needed to complete a form? So if you're going to need any personal documentation like your passport or driving license or your account number before registering, that might be information that's given to you as an instruction before completing a form. So let's look at how you can test this. Well, consider what information is needed to complete a form. What information do you need to know in order to complete the form opposite? Well, you may be familiar with the use of asterisks to indicate required fields, but not all users will be, so it's useful to explain that in a key. So if we have a look at this page, we can see there isn't actually a key. It's assuming that users will be familiar with the use of asterisk to indicate required fields. So a good instruction for this form would be immediately prior to the form, a single sentence that simply says required fields are indicated with an asterisk. Users would encounter that, and they would then know as they move through the form, any label that's announced with an asterisk preceding it, that would indicate a required field. So that's a good example, and it's a very common example, in fact, of instructions for completing forms. And it's also important that instructions should appear prior to forms. So I often see forms where the required fields key is displayed after the form. That's really no use. A sighted user may see it there before they complete the form, but a screen reader user certainly won't encounter that until after they've submitted the form, in which case it's probably going to be too late for them. So that's just a short bit on how to test for instructions. Moving on to error identification. This is the other end of the process when submitting forms. You submit a form with incorrect information and you will generate an error. So the W3C describes this as, if an input error is automatically detected, the error that is in error is identified and the error is described to the user in text. Really, that's common sense. It's telling users what has gone wrong and where it has gone wrong and giving them a chance to fix it. So why is it important? Well, we really want users to be able to locate errors and correct them. We're asking for their input so they can get additional information or support from our website, so it's important they're able to submit forms without a problem. It's important to note, just commenting on the screenshot I've got included here, that error identification must not rely on colour alone. So in this example, there's both text, there's a red outline, and there's also a visible cross next to each input field that has an error. Even if they weren't red, that information would still be quite clear. The cross would still be visible. So there is no reliance on colour there. It's just used as a visual emphasis, which is fine to make it more dramatic for sighted users. They can focus on that content more easily because of the colour there. And really, all users are going to benefit from having a decent error identification process within your forms. So how can you test for error identification? The first thing you can do is submit a form with either no data or invalid data. So just make up data, hammer the keyboard, press submit and see what happens. You want to ask yourself at that point, are errors displayed visually? Is it clear which fields contain errors from the errors that are displayed? And you must really check it with the screen reader to be absolutely sure that it's going to be usable in a very practical sense. So this is not an issue where we can just look at the code and determine if it's marked up properly. We really need to check it with the screen reader to make sure that when you submit the form and errors are detected, if you then tab through the form, the errors are announced to you and announced in such a way that you're very clear which field has got the error associated with it and what the error is. And like I said, it should be announced in plain text, as can be seen opposite. So how can you identify errors then as a developer? Well, a very simple way is actually using the area described by attribute. This allows you to associate an error message or any other description with an input field. So it simply points to the ID of the error. The area described by attribute goes on the input field, and it just means that when a screen reader user in particular, tabs onto that input field, both the label will be read out and then the error message will be read out. So that gives the user all they need to do to fix that error. It's best to describe in error in text which field is affected. So all of these error messages opposite do that. The title must be filled in, the last name must be filled in, the company name must be filled in. And also provide visual cues as to the erroneous fields. So here we've got a solid red border, but we've also got the cross, which is a very common indicator for error fields. Most users will be familiar with the use of a cross to indicate some sort of error, so it's used very effectively here. Related to identifying errors is the following success criteria, 3.3.3, or error suggestions. So the W3C describes this as, if an input error is automatically detected and suggestions for correction are known, then these suggestions are provided to the user unless it would jeopardize the security or purpose of the content. So if you have detected an error it's good practice to tell the user how to fix it, and how, if you've managed to analyze the data they submit, you may be able to give more specific instructions on how to fix the error in their case. So why are error suggestions important? Well, users with cognitive and comprehension difficulties might not understand some error messages. If you're just telling a user that an email address is invalid, that may not be enough information for them. Why is it invalid? They may not write their email address out very much. And really, all users will benefit from input assistance, particularly with forms that they've not filled in before. It's going to be a new experience for them, so they'll benefit from that sort of hand-holding that decent error suggestions can create. So here's an example that I found on the Eon website. This is part of the registration process, and submitting it with an incorrect account number, you get given a lengthy error message there which tells me several things. The account number I used was incorrect. It gives me information about how long it should be, between 8 and 12 characters, and it even tells me where to find it on my latest bill. It also mentions do not include spaces. I didn't include spaces that time, but I guess that's a useful thing to include, as that might be detected as part of the validation routine. So how do you test for error suggestions? In the same way that we identify and check for form error identification, submitting a form with either no data or with invalid data, or preferably both, one after the other, to check how the form responds in both cases. Once you've submitted the form with no data or with invalid data, check that are any errors suggested? Are there suggested ways of fixing those errors? Do they make sense? Are they relevant? If so, that should be fine for that success criteria. So just to repeat again, we've got a very good example here where entering an incorrect account number causes the error suggestion to announce what the length of the account number should be and where I can find it, which is really useful information. As with error identification, using the area described by attribute allows the suggestion to be associated with the error field. This means, again, for a screen reader user tabbing through the form, they'll tab onto an input field. First of all, they'll hear the label, and they will then subsequently hear the error suggestion read out to them. So that gives them exactly the same experience as a sighted user who has that visual proximity of the error suggestion to associate it for them. A screen reader can make use of the area described by attribute to create that same sort of proximity. If you use client-side validation, that is JavaScript validation, you can create custom errors a lot more easily. So you can actually analyze a submitted email address, check whether there's an @ symbol, for instance, and then you could have a custom error message for that saying your email address must contain an @ symbol. You're going to have to be pragmatic about this because there's only so many validation routines you're going to be able to run, but do have a think about what some of the more common errors that users might encounter when they're submitting your form. You may even wish to review any analytics or stats you've got to see what parts of a form users get to before having problems, and then use that as the basis for providing additional help and support at that point. Okay, finally moving on to 3.3.4, error prevention. This is related to when users submit legal or financial data. And the W3C describes this success criteria as for web pages that cause legal commitments or financial transactions for the user to occur, that modify or delete user controllable data in data storage systems, or that submit user test responses, at least one of the following is true. The submission is reversible, the user is given the opportunity to correct any identified errors, or a mechanism is available to allow users to check content before submitting. So really all this is saying is that if you are submitting a form that's going to submit legal financial data, you can check the data before you finally submit it. The form will check it for errors and give you a chance to correct them, and you can later undo it as well as another requirement. So why is this important? Well, clearly there's greater importance if you're submitting financial or legal data that may incur a cost or even a loss. So it's really important that this submitted data is correct. A really good way of doing this is providing a final review stage. This is very similar to online shopping, particularly from Amazon, where there is a final process before you click purchase, and that just gives you a single page where it outlines all of the information you have submitted, the things you're buying, the payment details you're using, the address, etc. And that final step is really what helps to satisfy this success criteria. In the case of Eon Energy, this would be relevant for forms that are used for bill payments. That's obviously a transaction involving money. So allowing users to submit that form only after completing a final review stage would be really useful. So how can you test this? Again, look for forms that do contain and ask you to submit financial legal data. So the common one we've just mentioned is bill payments, and then check for the presence of a final review step to check all the details prior to submission. What you're looking for is the ability to read and review all the details you've submitted, and critically given the option to then edit them if required, so you can change any errors that you identify at that point. If there is no option to do this, this would be really a failure. So if you complete a form to pay a bill, submit some financial data, and then just press submit button and the payment is taken, that would fail this checkpoint. So it's really important that you try and incorporate some of that checking, and providing a simple standalone review step at the end of the purchase process is the simplest way of doing that. So that's just a quick run through some of the key issues affecting form accessibility. I hope that's been useful, but if you do have any questions, please do feed any questions back to us via your line manager, and then we can be in touch to try and help you out. Thank you.